Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll get started in 1 second.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, and thanks everybody for joining the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law for our briefing on the 2020 election, an election where the ballots are still being counted. My name is Kristen Clark. I'm the President and Executive Director, and I'm joined today by John Greenbaum, who is Chief Counsel at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law, and by Harold Franklin, one of our board members who's based in Atlanta, Georgia, and who will provide a perspective about how the 2020 election played out in the state of Georgia. I want to start us off by offering some overall observations about the 2020 election season and the work that we did through our election protection program. This year, we operated virtually and worked to service voters across the country through the support of a network of over 42,000 legal volunteers who are all working remotely this season. On Election Day, we had many of those trained legal volunteers activated and at work through the support of 24 law firms that hosted about 30 call centers that fielded traffic from across the country on Election Day. Some data. The month of October was our peak season thus far. We fielded close to 150,000 calls in the month of October. On Election Day itself, we fielded close to 32,000 calls. What that makes clear is that the vast majority of Americans cast their ballots prior to Election Day. We were working throughout the month of October, 7 days a week, to help voters overcome barriers to mail-in voting. We helped voters navigate early voting opportunities in their state. We helped to restore confidence in mail voting in a season in which we've seen a lot of rhetoric intended to undermine public confidence in the mail voting system. The states where we saw highest call volume included Pennsylvania, Texas, Florida, New York, and Michigan. And what explains that pattern in part is that these are some of the states where barriers to the ballot proved particularly substantial this season. On Election Day, we received many complaints from voters. The top category of complaints concerned problems with voter identification, people who were told that their names were not on the registration rolls. The second highest category of complaint were complaints about intimidation and electioneering. This is something different about 2020 and most certainly reflects the unique moment that we are in. in 2020. It's been an incredibly racially polarized environment. We have seen efforts to recruit aggressive poll watchers who plan to be out with the goal of intimidating voters on election day. And we did receive those reports, but I will note that those reports were sporadic and often reports of isolated incidents. In many cases, one or two individuals who showed up with the intent of trying to intimidate voters, but we did not see a systemic or systematic deployment of poll watchers as we may have anticipated, given some of the calls that were made in advance of Election Day. Some may recall calls issued by Donald Trump Jr., who announced that they were working to recruit thousands of able-bodied men and women to go out on Election Day. In many instances, it just seems that those efforts did not materialize or take shape. And in the reports that we received, voters were determined and cast their ballots nonetheless. They reported these incidents of intimidation, but it did not stop them from having their voice heard. The third category of complaint concerned polling place access. That includes long lines, issues with machines malfunctioning, among other issues, polling sites that opened up late. There were a handful of lawsuits filed on Election Day by partner organizations that helped to secure extensions of poll hours in places like Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona. Over 100 million people voted in advance of Election Day. These are numbers that come from the Elections Project. This is a historic number that suggests that we may see fundamental change going forward in how Americans participate in our elections. The fact that an overwhelming majority of Americans chose to have their voice heard through mail voting and early voting may well become a permanent feature of American democracy. So where are we now? Right now, there is a lot of litigation, and John Greenbaum is going to talk about the litigation landscape in a moment, but I just want to talk about disinformation. We are seeing significant disinformation, particularly from President Trump himself, who has used social media platforms as a way to suggest that there are false ballots being cast in certain states. There are ballots that are disappearing. We have seen premature claims of victory. And yesterday, our organization, along with Common Cause, issued a demand to Twitter calling for the suspension of President Trump's account because he has used this account in ways that violates every aspect of Twitter's civic integrity policy. And we're deeply concerned about the chaos and confusion that this is causing for the public. We're very concerned about the ways in which this disinformation may be inciting the public. I think there is also a word to be said about the protests that we are seeing or have seen in certain cities across the country, including in Detroit. These protests stand to disrupt an otherwise orderly process that's being carried out by election officials who are doing their duty, who are merely carrying out the task of counting historic numbers of mail ballots, and we need to stand back and let them do their job. So we're very concerned about these protests and hope that state officials will do their job to ensure that poll workers can carry out their job in a safe and secure space. In all states, states have been carrying out the count in a transparent way. In many states, you can actually watch the count being carried out online. And in all of these states, election officials are abiding by rules with respect to poll watchers. There are rules and restrictions on poll watchers who are lawfully authorized inside count places where the count is being carried out, and the protesters seek to disrupt and defy those rules and restrictions. Final note that I will say is just a note about the power of the Black vote this season. We're already seeing early indications that there were surges in the numbers of Black voters that participated in Atlanta, Detroit, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, and many other cities across the country. In the days ahead, I think that there will be much to say about the significance and power of the Black voter turnout this season. And every indication suggests that Black voter turnout exceeded the levels that we saw in 2016 and may well have proven outcome determinative in elections on every end of the ballot, from both the bottom of the ballot all the way up to the top. So with that top line overview, I want to turn the floor over next to John Greenbaum to give an overview of the litigation landscape. And then we'll turn to Harold Franklin, who will talk about Georgia, where there is a lot playing out on the ground presently. John?
Thanks, Kristen. So this is my sixth presidential election as a voting rights lawyer. And this year we have seen an unprecedented amount of litigation, literally a couple hundred lawsuits in this election cycle in various forms. And Lawyers Committee has been involved in, I would say roughly now, maybe about 40 of those cases ourselves. One of the trends from the lawsuits that I think will be an unfortunate legacy, at least from our perspective of President Trump, is his impact on the federal courts, particularly the Supreme Court and the circuit courts. Just in terms of the Lawyers Committee, we went through a 2-week period in October in which we had 4 district court decisions in our favor get overturned by circuit courts. And I believe each of those circuit courts had at least one Trump appointee on them. And several of those cases were 2-to-1 decisions, and they were particularly painful. Now, post-election, or during and post-election, there have been a number of cases as well going on in the various states. And for the most part, judges have been pretty dismissive of these cases that have been brought. Some have been brought in state court, some have been brought in federal court by either formally the Republican Party, in some cases the party itself, in some cases Republican candidates, in some cases Republican voters. And for the most part, these claims really have not had much to them and have been promptly dismissed. I watched 2 of the cases that came up yesterday. One was in Georgia, having to do with 53 absentee ballot votes in Chatham County, and the other was a case in Michigan involving 2 claims. One had to do with observers at absentee ballot counts, and the other was a demand of the Secretary of State that she order all of the election officials, all the city clerks, to provide videotapes of every single drop box that was in the state. And I have to say, these cases were hastily put together. They barely passed the laugh test, and the judges were relatively dismissive. Similarly, we've seen a series of cases that have been brought in Nevada, both before the election, during the election, now after the election, that also just do not seem to have much traction at all. The latest case was brought last night by a voter who had earlier made a claim in state court, which had been rejected in state court. She claimed that she had not voted a mail-in ballot, and when she went to go vote in person, she was told that she voted a mail-in ballot and that she couldn't vote a regular ballot in person. And what the county has said was they gave her the opportunity to demonstrate, to sign an affidavit saying, in fact, that she hadn't voted previously by absentee ballot, and she refused to do so. And the case was basically brought in order to try to stop the count in Nevada. And as I said, this case was recently refiled last night in federal court. I expect there will be a hearing of some sort today. But the place that has had the most during election and post-election litigation has been in Pennsylvania. And I had to have one of our lawyers, John Powers, actually send me a document because it's almost impossible to keep track of all these cases at once. He sent me 6 pending cases right now going on, or 6 cases that have been recently brought or pending right now that are going on, both in a combination of state and federal court. And then in addition to that, there's several prior decisions that were made that can be appealed. Some of the issues had to do with observing of the vote by Republican poll watchers. Some of the issues had to do with absentee ballots and cure processes for absentee ballots. Some counties made significant efforts if a person had not completely filled out their absentee ballot application, to notify the voter of that, give the voter a chance to cure that. In addition to that, another issue that's come up with provisional ballots are people that were given a mail-in ballot or asked for a mail-in ballot, had it sent to them, didn't return that mail-in ballot, either because they forgot to return it, didn't receive it, went to go vote at the polls and were given provisional ballots. And there are a bunch of cases regarding the procedures under which those provisional ballots should count. And so we're closely monitoring the litigation in all the states. There are circumstances in which we may participate in them. There was one of the cases this morning where there was a hearing in Pennsylvania. We filed a amicus brief last night in that case. In addition to all those cases, there is the one case that's before the Supreme Court right now that came up before the election, having to do with a ruling by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court that people that sent their absentee ballots in and they were received within 3 days of the election would get those ballots counted, provide absent demonstration that the ballot was cast after Election Day. So for example, if the ballot had a postmark of Wednesday or Thursday, it wouldn't be counted. Otherwise, absent that showing that it would. It's hard to say what's going to happen with that case. It may in fact go away if, as a result of the other votes, Vice President Biden is still ahead. There would effectively be nothing left to argue in that case, in our opinion. So it's still a dynamic, changing environment. I think every day brings more clarity, and we're gonna continue to be on top of it. I guess there's.
Sure. So first of all, Kristen and John, thank you for your leadership. The Lawyers Committee really does amazing work to protect voters on a nonpartisan basis. It's such a valued service that our profession in particular provides. And so I'm just honored to serve as chair of Georgia Election Protection's Legal Committee and to be with such an incredible organization. So, John mentioned dynamic. That certainly is what I would describe as what happened in Georgia, not just on Election Day, but also during the early voting period here. I think we are very pleased with the level of engagement and turnout from Georgia voters. It's been very encouraging to see the level of interest. We had unprecedented turnout in terms of the advanced voting period that was discussed and written about a good bit in the media in terms of many of the long lines, et cetera, that we had. We did have in Georgia some technical issues with the ENET system that checks in voters, and that happened during the advanced voting period and resulted in some of those photographs that many have seen in the national media of what happened here. I think on Election Day, as a result of both the pandemic and concerns about voting in person, The use of absentee ballots certainly skyrocketed and was unprecedented, along with the level of participation during advance voting. And I think the two of those things certainly combined and resulted in, although there was robust turnout on Tuesday, it certainly was less than it would have been otherwise. And I think that's a good thing in light of all the concerns about the pandemic. I think there were certainly some concerns on a systemic level here from technology issues that we experienced with poll pads that you may have heard about. Those poll pads, unfortunately, many of them were programmed the night before the election and had issues in which they could not encode the voter cards, and that resulted in a backlog and concerns, and in some places, countywide system failure, such that there were such long lines. Spalding County is an example of where that happened. We did get accounts from other counties that were also affected in a way that resulted in the voting cards not being able to be imprinted, and therefore those locations running out of paper ballots and voters not being able to vote. So that was an issue that certainly resulted in the extension of polling hours there beyond 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock and ultimately 11 o'clock p.m. We got a great number of calls from voters about what happens, how will their vote be counted if they are voting in that extended after hours period. So we fielded a lot of questions about that. We were able to, as a result of, and certainly we functioned virtually for the first time ever, and that was a challenge, but we were able to rise to the occasion, and each component of the program, the hotline, the field program, and litigation, certainly the field program was obviously not virtual. Aspects of it were, but we were able to really adapt to the circumstances, we think, in a way that was challenging, but we were able to accomplish that. I think that, there were a lot of concerns about absentee ballots. As many are aware, in Georgia, our state retained an out-of-state vendor in Arizona to process absentee ballot requests. And between that and the Postal Service issues, it resulted in significant delays of voters who requested absentee ballots in terms of receiving them. And so we had those concerns. I think the national discourse about concerns about the integrity of the process, about the postal system, et cetera, and quite candidly, historic disenfranchisement from years past had a lot of voters very concerned about voting by absentee ballot, and many, and some chose to, notwithstanding having that ballot, to come in and to cast a ballot in person in light of all the rhetoric that was happening about whether their votes will be counted. And so we were able to assist voters in who did choose to do that and to come in, notwithstanding the pandemic, to have their absentee ballots canceled so that they could cast an in-person ballot. Lots of questions about that. There were certainly questions about provisional ballots and the use of them, and again, concerns about the supply of those backup paper ballots in the event of computer failure, and we did experience some of that, and again, in some of the counties. And so those are some of the issues that we saw. I think I'd like to highlight the importance of our collaborative efforts with our grassroots partners. This initiative, and this I think is my fifth presidential election cycle in election protection, but this initiative in Georgia, at least, part of the strength of the program is, one, the relationships that we have built with election officials to resolve problems for voters in real time on election day and before election day, but our partnership with our grassroots partners. For example, Helen Butler is the leader of our grassroots partners, and there are many organizations involved. In Georgia, we had thousands of volunteers, and many of them were legal volunteers from law firms, and we were very encouraged by the level of engagement. For example, at King and Spalding, we had more volunteers than we have ever had before, and at so many other law firms also, Kilpatrick, Stockton, the virtual command center. And so I think it's just an example of agreeing to coalesce around core values of the importance of protecting the integrity of the electoral process, no matter what your political views are, and that every voter who is eligible should be able to vote and to have confidence that their vote will be counted. So that is a success of this program. I think, Kristen, to your point earlier, we had unprecedented turnout of Black voters and voters of color, I think in general, and that has been a positive sign of that level of engagement. And post-election, John mentioned the Chatham County litigation that was dismissed yesterday. We certainly have received reports from those there in Savannah of concerns about individuals after the denial of that complaint or petition, that there were individuals dispatched to the location to observe, and many felt it was intimidating to have them there interfering with that process. That those are reports that we have received. We have worked, of course, always to try to confirm those types of issues, but we have worked to deploy volunteers to observe what was actually happening there on the ground in Chatham, for example. But I know that in multiple counties that there are efforts to continue to count and process the votes, those votes that are certainly properly cast, absentee ballots or provisional ballots. And we are now in the process of assisting voters in curing their ballots. And that process has to be completed by today. And so we have gotten a lot of questions from voters about that process and how they go about doing it. We would just encourage voters, again, to call the 1-866 our vote number, and we hope to have volunteers who are able to, and we do have volunteers to be able to help with that process, because whatever is allegedly deficient about, for example, the provisional ballot, whether it is that ID is required, that information has to be provided to the county election officials today, or those votes will not be counted. So that's a major effort that we are in the midst of trying to help with that cure process. And it's something that we've always done as an organization, again, on behalf of any voter who calls us and needs that type of assistance. So I think it just speaks to the power of collaboration and lawyers and the legal community coalescing around this core value of our democracy, our institutions, and ensuring that their franchise is protected and that everyone can vote and have their vote counted if they choose to exercise their right to vote. So a lot of things it's dynamic. A lot is still happening, but we are excited about our efforts and our ability to assist voters and to be a part of this incredible effort.
Thanks so much, Harold. And, I want to underscore the important work that needs to happen right now with respect to taking action to ensure that your provisional ballot counts. So for those who are watching, who may be engaged in advocacy in their communities, it's really important that we get the message out that if you cast a provisional or paper ballot in this election, there may be steps that you have to take to ensure that your ballot counts. And time is running short on that for that process. Georgia's deadline, as Harold notes, is 5 p.m. today. And we have trained legal volunteers who are helping voters by the thousands right now. We're operating from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to help voters overcome the steps they have to take in their states. The other issue are those who cast mail ballots. In some instances, officials may have sent a notice out to voters indicating a minor error with your mail ballot, and there may be an opportunity to cure or address that minor issue. By way of example, and there was litigation over this, the state of Pennsylvania will not count a ballot if the voter did not put the ballot in a secrecy envelope before putting it into the final envelope mailed to the voter. That's what's called a naked ballot. And there are significant numbers, sadly, of eligible voters whose mail ballots are not being counted in the state of Pennsylvania because they have a rule in that state by which naked ballots will not be accepted. But those rules vary in all 50 states. We have a fractured election system. So we want to make sure that voters, if they have the opportunity to cure a minor issue with their mail ballot, that they're doing so. And we also want to make sure that voters are taking the steps necessary to ensure that their provisional ballot counts. And while there is focus, tremendous focus right now on the presidency on the top of the ballot, frankly, these issues matter for contests that extend all the way down the ballot in all 50 states. So an important call to action right now for those who are watching. I want to just add one point regarding the United States Postal Service. There have been many lawsuits brought regarding Louis DeJoy and the significant changes made on his watch in how mail is processed, sorted, and delivered. And our partners at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund have active litigation before Judge Sullivan in the DC District Court, where we learned that 150,000 mail ballots were not delivered until November 4th, the day after Election Day. And according to the US Postal Service, there are about 4,250 ballots that are missing between Pennsylvania and North Carolina. So very, very troubling to think about the Trump administration's appointment of Louis DeJoy and the impact that had on the speedy and efficient delivery of mail ballots in this election season. There's some great questions here that we want to turn to, but I want to turn the floor over for just a minute or two to CK Hoffler, who's president of the National Bar Association and another core partner in our election protection program, to just say a brief word. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much, Kristen and Harold and Jonathan, for the incredible briefing and the work that the Lawyers Committee is doing. We just want to say we love this partnership. We have worked with the Lawyers Committee for many years. And this year we took our partnership and our collaboration to another level because of the enthusiasm of our members and the need of for the National Bar Association to be prominently engaged in protecting the right to vote. So we formed alliances in addition with the Lawyers Committee, and all of our efforts for election protection came through the Lawyers Committee, which was great. We were on the hotlines, we're hotline captains, National Command Center, but we also forged alliances with the Divine Nine, 5 of the Divine Nine, and thousands of lawyers came through to work with our collaborative efforts of being in our community and being leaders. And so in Georgia, we have 3 affiliate chapters: Gate City Bar, DeKalb Lawyers, and Gabois. So Harold Franklin, past president of Gate City Bar, dynamic, extraordinary leader in our community. We thank you for what you're doing. And this collaboration has been great. We are all over and working with you all, including Florida. These battleground states, Pennsylvania, a lot of our members are on point in the community, working and ensuring that justice is done and democracy is preserved. So Kristen, thank you for giving me the opportunity to just make a few remarks and for recognizing, I think we have topped the 7,000 lawyers that we wanted to have out there in the communities. And we're delighted to do so. And we're also poised to help with the litigation going forward, because based on our reports that we're receiving and our 80+ affiliate chapters, sections and regions throughout the country, we're hearing, especially in those battleground states, especially in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, we're hearing that there's going to be a strong need for lawyers to jump in and to help with this litigation. So we're ready and poised to do that. And again, thank you for giving me the opportunity of addressing this extraordinary effort.
Thank you.
Kristen, if I could just say, we are fortunate in Georgia to have CK Hoffler as the NBA president. And so it's been a pleasure to partner with her and to have her support and leadership and resources in Georgia to add to the effort. So it really speaks to the power of this partnership. And thank you, CK, for your incredible leadership.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're going to turn to the questions because there are many good ones. John, let me ask you this question about faithless electors. We got a question from Vicky, who's been a longtime partner in election protection, who is asking about whether electors will be obligated to vote according to their state's popular vote. What are your thoughts on that? And there was the case was heard by the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I think the answer to that is going to be yes. As you referenced, Kristen, there was the Supreme Court case earlier this year about faithless electors, and the court essentially said that the electors have to follow what's required by the popular vote in the state. We'll see if there are sort of attempts at shenanigans in terms of the electoral vote, whether there will be state legislatures that will try to deny the electoral vote. I think that would be, if anything, more likely than the faithless elector, because in most of these cases, the people that are electors are going to support the candidate from their party, especially when things are as divided as they are now. But that's one of the issues that we've been delving into this year, is the degree to which there can be efforts to deviate from what the actual vote count is in the states. So there may be some effort to do that. I don't think ultimately it will be successful, and we'll certainly be prepared to go forward if somebody tries to vote in a way that's different than the popular vote.
There's also a question from Justin. Thank you for this question about cured ballots, and whether, as the ballots are cured, they are being incorporated into the current count or being set aside and counted last. And Harold, I wonder if you know how they're handling this issue in Georgia.
So in Georgia, in order to cure one's ballot, whether there's an issue with an absentee ballot or a provisional ballot, one must, there's an affidavit that needs to be signed along with, for example, identification. That would need to be brought into the registrar's office, but it also could be faxed for those who have access to fax machines, et cetera. But it certainly does raise a concern regarding those without resources, including fax machines or technology, smartphones, et cetera, being able to, and understanding how they go about getting that information in timely. So that's, part of the value of what we provide, is to be able to answer those questions and to assist voters, again, without regard to who they are supporting, to be able to ensure that their vote is actually counted. But it is not an easy process, and it's complicated by the pandemic, and that is what makes it such a challenge.
Yeah, and as to whether or not they're immediately incorporated into vote totals, that practice may vary by state.
In fact, it could vary by county. Also, we have found that counties took different approaches to issues where you would think there would be uniformity, and it really speaks to the need of a top-down message for consistency's sake. But it could certainly vary, and that's certainly part of the concern.
There's also a question about North Carolina and getting involved in efforts to support curing of ballots, et cetera, in North Carolina. And it's an interesting question because North Carolina, I believe, has the longest time window by which ballots can be returned. And John, you can correct me, ballots in North Carolina have to be postmarked by Election Day, and I think they're 7 to 10 days. They will be returned.
It's 9 days. This was the subject of litigation this year, that the normal rule is 3 days, but through a piece of litigation that got settled, it's a total of 9 days. But it still has to be, as you said, the ballots still have to be postmarked by Election Day.
Right. And there is actually important work that can be done in North Carolina right now to help voters cure ballots. I actually looked at this personally. The state of North Carolina allows somebody who casts a provisional ballot to go and check their status but it doesn't appear that they're going to do so immediately, meaning you may not be able to do that today. And so for voters in North Carolina, we encourage you to call the 866 Our Vote hotline so we can try and interface with county election officials to get an answer about the status of your ballot. But I think North Carolina is likely to be the state that is last to complete the count this election season, would be my bet.
Of the states in which the presidential election or Senate election is close, because believe it or not, in California, if a ballot is sent on election day but received within 17 days of the election, it will be counted. California, I think, actually has the latest date. But of the states that the people are most concerned about right now, North Carolina and Nevada. I think Nevada is also 9 days. If ballot is postmarked on election day and received within 9 days, it'll be counted.
The other issue that's looming here are military voters. The state of Washington actually accepts ballots from military voters up through November 25th, 3 weeks after election day. So it's interesting as we have this debate about wrapping up the count and completing the count. We are at base minimum talking about disenfranchising those who are serving in the military and serving our country abroad, who often historically have been provided these additional windows of time for their mail ballots to be returned. Why we wouldn't extend the same privilege to Americans right here in this country is beyond me. Let's look at some other questions. The Supreme Court, the likelihood that the Supreme Court interjects itself into any of these pending election battles.
I think it's going to depend. I mean, in terms of kind of post-election relief, essentially contesting an election, the general rule that courts follow is they don't interfere unless it might make a difference in terms of who's the winner and who's the loser. So for example, I mentioned before the case that's currently in front of the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania, having to do with whether a ballot that's received after election day but postmarked by election day, whether that will be counted, which is what the Pennsylvania Supreme Court essentially found. And the Supreme Court deadlocked as to whether to issue a stay on that and make the requirement that the ballot be received by election day, but left room for it to take it up after the election. Truth of the matter is the Supreme Court really should not be concerning themselves with that case if by that time President Biden is the winner, since it was Republicans that have essentially brought that case. They stand nothing to gain if you have the situation of Vice President Biden is the winner if you count all the votes other than those votes. But we'll see. I mean, we're very concerned about the issue that Justice Kavanaugh raised, and that in a separate opinion in a different case or actually it was in the Pennsylvania case that Justice Alito raised regarding the Supreme Court not deferring to decisions made by state Supreme Courts when they're deciding state constitutional issues. We're very concerned about that, but I don't think the court should actually touch that issue given what's likely to happen with the vote in Pennsylvania at this point. A couple of people have asked questions about recounts.
Right. And also who's allowed to serve as a poll watcher, and
Depends on the state.
Yeah, exactly.
So for example, yeah.
Go ahead.
I'll give you the example of the two states in which recounts might be possible. In Wisconsin, you do not have to be, anybody can observe. you're limited in terms of how many people can observe, but you can have political people and non-political people observe. We're a recount, and one of the things in terms of election protection is we might have people observe the recount, particularly in Milwaukee. Keep in mind that the recount doesn't happen in one place. The recount happens in one place where that's an election jurisdiction. And in Wisconsin, it's actually each municipality runs the election. So I don't know what the exact number is, but I think it's several hundred electoral bodies in Wisconsin. In Georgia, it's at the county level. There are 159 counties. Is that right, Harold? In Georgia.
That is correct, John. 159.
And I believe there it's only partisans that can observe. But one thing to keep in mind in recounts is you're unlikely to see significant changes in the vote count through a recount. So in Wisconsin, it's about a 20,000 voter difference, and recount there is gonna be a futile exercise. In fact, Scott Walker, the former Republican governor of Wisconsin, who's personally familiar with recounts, I think has said the same about Wisconsin. And in Georgia, because Georgia has electronic voting machines for the people that voted in person, a recount is not going to be all that. There's not going to be all that much going on substantively in terms of a recount there, because it's not actually going to go back through actually reading the markings on each ballot, because they actually rely on the barcodes to do a recount. That was one of the concerns about using what they call BMDs in Georgia, is that it really doesn't provide for a substantive means of doing a recount.
And there were certainly concerns about deploying these new machines so close to what was certain to be an unprecedented election in many ways. And so those are excellent points, John. We do have new machines in Georgia this cycle.
So there was a question about Washington, from Washington State, about the potential disparate treatment of Latino voters through the curing process. And that, to me, raises an alarm and is an issue that we should look into given our recent experience. I think, for example, about Gwinnett County, Georgia during the 2018 midterms, where we saw ballots rejected by African-American and Asian-American voters at astronomically higher rates. They were using things like signature match verification, or you failed to provide 4 digits of your birth year on the envelope, you only provided 2 digits. In rolling up our sleeves and digging deeply, we found out that there was something going on in Gwinnett County, and we were able to sue and ensure that those ballots were fairly handled and treated. So I think that this is an issue that we should be wary of. I'm glad that this person raised this issue. There's this focus on kind of a handful of states right now, but the reality is we want to ensure that provisional ballots, opportunities to cure minor issues with mail ballots, are issues that we're looking at nationally. We have elections on the ballot that extend beyond the presidency and go all the way down the ballot. And so these issues really matter, particularly because our elections often come down to razor thin margins. So please do surface these issues to the 866 Our Vote hotline, but that one seemed to raise a red flag. Let's see. Yes, go ahead, Harold.
To your point about 2018 and the ballots at issue, they're over 50,000. I think this is just a point that we need to be able to have an honest discussion about many of the measures that have been put in place allegedly to prevent voter fraud, which we know from the data is virtually non-existent or extremely rare. And these measures, for example, in that instance, a very high percentage, I think 60% or more of the affected voters, there were voters of color. And so I think we just, it's important that we have a discussion about the means and whether or not it makes sense for some of these measures to be put in place. They appear to be in many ways a solution looking for a problem. And I think that highlights the importance of the work that we do and the importance of the legal landscape since the Shelby County decision of ensuring the integrity of the process and also preventing disenfranchisement. That's an excellent point.
Yeah. Someone asked whether there's anything that can be done to extend the deadline for ballot curing in Georgia. And I'm going to say the answer to that one is probably no. Post-electoral fixes to these issues, I think, are a near impossibility, but there sure was a lot of litigation in advance of Election Day to deal with precisely these issues, making sure that voters would have opportunity to get notice and the chance to cure any issue. That was a common theme of a lot of the cases that we brought at the Lawyers Committee and that many partner organizations brought this season. So we are short on time, but have some great questions. So maybe we'll just do kind of a final set of remarks, kind of where do we go from here? The election season is not yet over. There's one person who asked whether fixing the Voting Rights Act, restoring the Voting Rights Act might help to address some of the issues that are on display right now across the country. So maybe we can just kind of do a bit of a round robin response about where do we go from here?
Okay, so one thing that there were a lot of questions in the chat about was what about the runoffs in Georgia in January? And I just want to assure people that we will be quite involved. All the people, all the panelists here will be quite involved in what will be a vigorous election protection program in January in Georgia. And then the broader question in terms of going forward, I think this election makes a strong case for electoral reform, both in restoring the Voting Rights Act, but also having some national standards for federal elections with respect to some of the reforms that we've seen, like allowing for all people to be able to cast, all voters to be able to cast mail-in ballots, and having a minimum number of early in-person voting days in each state, that having more voter-friendly rules for how people vote, we saw in this election help drive up turnout. And we think that voters demonstrated they liked having those choices. It also created fewer problems in terms of how elections were administered on Election Day, because you had 50 million people voting on Election Day as opposed to 150 million people voting on Election Day. So there weren't as many places that had long lines. You did have machines break down, but not to the degree that you would have if you would have had all those people voting in person. So those will be reforms that will be pushed at the states as well. And I think also related to that is when our absentee ballots canvassed. I think one of the things that we're seeing in Pennsylvania is a result of the fact that the election officials weren't able to start looking at absentee ballots until Election Day, whereas states like Florida, where it could be done weeks before Election Day, were able to report their results much more quickly.
So, Kristen, I would say that there is a lot. It's clear from what we've seen in this election cycle that the need for advocacy and involvement of the legal community is as great now as it has ever been. I think that as a society, we should do more to make voting easier certainly ensuring that only eligible voters can vote, but to make it easier and to remove some of the barriers, that will remain part of our mission and extremely important. I do think it's interesting, certainly from my perspective as a Georgia lawyer, the restoral of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act of 2020. I think that is going to be, that will be key. It will really help to put us back where we need to be regarding pre-clearance and many of the measures that have been put in place that undeniably disproportionately affect communities of color. I think that that's an honest discussion that we need to have, and that's something that we need to do, that this country should do to restore that in a way that would pass muster under the rationale for the prior decision. And I think that we have the data to demonstrate that. And I think that you need look no further than some of the studies that have been done about measures that have been put in place that have these impacts. And so I think those are things that we need to look at, but to make it easier to vote, not more difficult, and to expand and not restrict the franchise. That's what we should all be about as an organization and as a nation.
Agreed. And I wish we had more time. They're just such great questions here. We're actually going to do another one of these next week once we kind of see what the world looks like at that point. So we invite all of you back to rejoin us. I would just say, as final observations, I think this election season shows how fractured our elections are in this country. 50 states that all have incredibly different approaches to how they run their elections. You know, Bush v. Gore was a turning point in our democracy. I think that it was an awakening for many Americans about the breaks in our election systems, right? But the hanging chad problems of yesterday have been replaced by incredibly disparate rules across the country about who has access to absentee ballots and what are the deadlines for requesting and returning those ballots. And it's patently unfair. And I think that the pandemic and this experience of the 2020 election has laid bare how incredibly just fractured our election system is. And we need more uniform rules so that the experience of voting and accessing the ballot in our country is more fair and equal. If you live in Texas, it was a lot harder to vote in 2020 than if you lived in a state like California. In Texas, they literally limited who had access to mail ballots. They had one drop box per county. In California, if you were an active registered voter, the ballot just arrived at your doorstep. And to me, that's not a system that we can tolerate, and makes clear the work that we've got to do to strengthen democracy for all Americans. And restoring the Voting Rights Act is one first step, but then making sure that we have same-day registration and no excuse access to absentee ballots, and lots of opportunities for early voting. There are parts of our country that don't have early voting. Easy access to vote by mail. We need postage paid envelopes. We need to scrap notary requirements and witness requirements, which really bog down voters in many parts of our country this season. There's just a lot of work to do to make our system more uniform. But for right now, I think the work that we've got to do is championing the importance of counting every ballot. The election is over. There's no voting taking place. And there's a lot of rhetoric out there that I think has incited a certain segment of the population. But the reality is that the election is over, and we need to let election officials do their job and count the ballots so that we can have an outcome that Americans know is true and fair and representative of the voices of 150 million Americans who spoke up and participated and overcame tremendous obstacles amid a pandemic to participate this season. And I think we can play a part in that by lifting up that narrative and making sure that people are taking action now to, again, make sure that their ballot was counted, make sure that they're curing issues with mail ballots and taking steps to ensure that provisional ballots are counted. And hopefully we can harness all of this energy and interest into the work that we've got to do in 2021 when we start to turn to redistricting. But thank you all for joining us. Look for an invitation to a briefing that we'll hold next week once we see what the landscape looks like in the days ahead. Thank you for joining us. And call 866-OUR-VOTE if you need help.